He's Howard Eibach, former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 30 years. I'm giving him credit, he's close enough. 30 years
Rounding.
of it. Yeah, rounding error. With 30 years of experience, together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, boy, do we have a topic today. I'm on the mailing list, and you are too, of Mark Pollard, who is a world globe hopping strategist. I don't know if he actually practices strategy anymore, but he is one heck of a good teacher of strategy and all things related. He's come up with a roughly 60-page PDF, which he's converted to a PDF from a PowerPoint, called Creative Brief 101. And it's all kind of useful tips to help strategists write better briefs. It's just food for creative brief nerds like you and me. So I thought we'd tackle part of it. It's a free PDF. I think if you can find your way to his website, you can download it. I think we'll try to find a link and include it in the particulars for our show so others can take a look at it. We're not going to cover the whole thing. We're going to grab a couple of points that each of us is attuned to and discuss it. But let me just say from the outset, we've been trying to get Mark on the show. He's just kind of a hard guy to pin down because he travels so much. If you look at his travel schedule, I don't know how he does it, but he's bouncing around the globe. He's got more frequent flyer miles than pilots. This is an amazing document, an amazing collection, and I think you and I would both agree it aligns pretty well with our own thinking and the stuff that we've been talking about for the last 4.5 years. Nevertheless, it's a cool summary, a cool compilation of his best thinking, and I'm gonna grab one point, and you're gonna grab a point. We'll talk about it. Maybe there'll be some disagreements. I doubt it. One of the things that he says, and this is kind of a 40,000-foot level thing, is, and one of the things I appreciate about what Mark's attitude is, he takes a kind of poet's approach to writing strategy. And I think he can get away with this, as you and I were talking before we hit record, because of who his audience is. He travels around the world, as I said, teaching strategy in all aspects of strategy. Plus, he's written a phone book sized book on strategy, whose title I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe I'll recall it later in the show. So he's done a lot of thinking, but his audience is probably the mid-level to higher to senior level strategists who are comfortable with their profession, who feel they're confident in their brief writing skills and want to go to the next level. So Mark has taken advantage of that audience, and he has really addressed it in that sense. So when he takes a more poetic, when I use the term judiciously, a poetic approach to writing a brief, what I mean by that, what I think he means by that is stretch. And you're going to talk about your favorite point, which is about, honesty in the brief. When you talk about being honest, this is what he means when he says stretch and do more than just impart facts. So in a sense, he's kind of like the Bukowski of brief writers, whereas as an instructor, I take the approach of being more like Leonard Bernstein with a red pen. And what I love about his approach is that he really is pushing brief writers and strategists to think broadly and to think differently about how to answer the questions on the brief. My one concern about that is you got to know the fundamentals first. You got to know the chords. You got to know how to do a layup. You got to know how to putt. You got to know these basics before you can break the rules. As you pointed out, as before I hit the record button, Ernest Hemingway was famous for writing run-on sentences and sentence fragments in his prose. But he knew the rules. He knew what he was doing, and he was doing it for a certain effect. I admire that, and I admire strategists who stretch. But my one point of contention with Mark is know what you're doing first, get those precision language down, because as you and I have said many times in the podcast, Henry, we aspire to inspiration in a brief, but you got to be clear. Creatives can work with clear. So that's my take on just one point of his
Yeah,
PDF.
I agree completely. As we said, you're teaching workshop to marketers mainly. Writing briefs for whom this is a very small portion of their daily tasks. They understand and want to get better at it. And so they need to know the basics. And again, as you said, clarity, I think, is job one. That doesn't mean it's the only job. Inspiration is important, and getting to inspiration is something that each strategist slash brief writer has to struggle with. Like, how do I take this and make it inspiring, and elevate my game as a strategist. But if I'm teaching a workshop for account people that never write briefs, just because I think they might benefit from it, or in case they have to write a brief in a pinch, we're trying to teach them the basics, right? So we want them to learn, if you know these three chords, you could play a song, right? And that's what we want them to be able to play a song. Now, uh, down the line, when they get a lot of practice, they could be soloing and doing all kinds of things, but that's not really the nature of your students, or generally the people that I've taught who are much earlier kind of in their careers, or first becoming acquainted with this thing that we call the creative brief. So I do appreciate that Mark is a high level strategist teaching to people that have a lot of aptitude for it, probably have already years of experience under their belt. And what he's urging them to do is kind of shed some of the bad habits or things that they may have, some of the more structured thinking that they may have been locked into because of the way that they were taught or whatever, and basically saying, look, there is a whole world of brief writing out there that is more unconstrained, and that can be very, very powerful. And I agree with that completely. But you got to walk before you run.
We had an episode about that when we were talking about the open brief. I mean, that's a scary approach
Yes.
to a document that is supposed to have guardrails. And here we had a whole episode where what happens when you remove those guardrails? So Mark isn't quite to that point where it's like the sky's the limit, but he is approaching that point of view. So what particular point that he made in his many pages that you particularly liked?
There's obviously 67 pages. There's a lot of good stuff here, but there's right off the bat, the first section I thought I would comment on, which was honest versus dishonest creative briefs. And unlike what we were just talking about, I think that this is something that even beginning strategists can learn. In fact, I think it's something that probably more experienced strategists already kind of know, um, but that perhaps starting off in strategy. And what do we mean, or what does he mean by dishonest briefs? And he talks about, he gives like some of the earmarks of like what a dishonest brief does. It's they avoid problems, they hide behind jargon, they over explain, they numb with numbers, they try to sound intelligent instead of clear, they make too many compromises to the 50 comments from the rest of the team in the Google Doc. So I think that's a pretty good diagnosis. Um, I hate using jargon just in general, because to me it's like I don't have the time to explain this to you, and if it's an important concept, you have to have the time to explain it to the creatives, right? Like if you're gonna abbreviate something later in the brief, then you better define it up front and don't assume. And I always, we've talked about this before, I always go into brief writing with the idea in the back of my mind that this brief may eventually end up in the hands of a freelancer who doesn't know the client, doesn't know the industry. So I like to be clear and basic, and not hide behind jargon and things like that. But there's also honesty and dishonesty in the sense of, how should I put it? When a brand has a problem, there's no sense in sugarcoating that problem, because if you do, you're not going to get to something that can help cure that problem, right? So if you have a brand that has bad quality perceptions among the target audience, hiding that, obscuring it, or not including that in a brief does you more damage than good, I think. I think an honest brief says, yes, we have this problem in terms of perception, but here's the bright side, or here's what the brand is doing to alleviate that, or here's what the consumer doesn't see about these quality concerns, and I'm not blaming consumers, but it could be anything from like, well, they didn't follow the instructions correctly. They didn't maintain the product the way that it was supposed to be maintained. Like, so I think that the idea of honesty in a brief, what I liked about this is it's rarely put in those terms when we talk about
Yeah.
creative briefs in terms of honesty and dishonesty. But I do think that a lot of times briefs can become a whitewash for the client brand and its problems. And I think that getting down, right down to the meat of it, right? Like warts and all, is more helpful than trying to obfuscate like some bad news or some things. And I guess this also kind of speaks to, do you believe in the product and the brand that you're selling? Because if you don't believe in it, then you're probably going to be dishonest about it. But if you believe
Yeah.
in it, you're probably going to try to find ways to address the issues in a constructive way, understanding that we don't control, the assembly line and the product quality that comes out, how the user uses the product, the price, the warranty or the guarantee. Like we don't control that. We only control the comms, but we can set expectations and do other things. Maybe it's a bad rap in terms of, yeah, we have quality concerns, but so do all our other competitors. We're statistically no worse than any of them. So um, it, I've seen it happen, I think a lot of times this dishonesty lies in a benign trying to hide the warts of the product or the brand, and sometimes creativity lies in really exploring those things deeply and coming up with a, so what, here's what this product gives you that's you know miles ahead of the competition, for which you might accept certain defects. So that doesn't mean the communication has to be about those weaknesses. But as long as strategically we know where the landmines are, then we can provide the creatives a good roadmap to avoid them.
Well, I think it's really hard to be honest in the advertising if your brief isn't honest. And this is something that Bill Bernbach has said, George Tannenbaum has said it. Honesty is a scary place to be creatively, but it has to me, the most fertile ground. Because you just say, this is, and the way to get around this whole issue that you addressed, that you brought up, what if you don't buy into the product? What if you don't like the product? Well, you can avoid that by simply saying, can I put myself in the position of the customer? Can I walk a mile in his or her shoes and understand what her problem is and how this product might, if not solve it, make it a little bit better? So then I don't have to ask the question or even answer the question, do I like this product? Would I buy that myself? No, but I understand how she uses it. So the honesty of a brief translates into the honesty, I think, of the creative itself. Um,
It's
which
it's
leads me to, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
I
It's
was going to
funny
ask you
that
a question.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Bernbach because the famous VW ad that we've all talked about a million times was really about how that car was so different than everything else that was out there at the time. It was small, it was rear engine, it was air
Air
cooled,
cooled.
it was
Cheap.
it was cheap, and so it wasn't pretentious in the ways that a lot of American cars were at the time. There were these land yachts, big four door. There were gas guzzlers. They instead of trying to obfuscate that, they basically said, "Look, this is what the car is. These are some benefits that maybe you didn't think about when you own a car like this. The insurance is going to be less. Your gas bill is going to be less."
At a time when that wasn't even an issue.
Correct. But it what it did was it peeled away a certain segment of the car buying public for which this car did make sense. And I
Yeah.
think that that's another lesson is, by the way, for marketers in general, and we've talked about it, is you don't need to convince 99% of people. If you have 10% share, you only need to convince 1% of the buying public to come to your way of thinking, and that's a 10% increase in your sales right there.
Well,
So
I mean, in direct response, I don't know if these numbers have changed, but when I was working in direct response, if you get a 1 to 2% response rate, you were doing really well. Now, I don't know if that number has changed, like I said, but again, you send out 2 to 3 million pieces in the mail, and you get 1% of those to respond.
and in
Convert.
this case, if we're trying to change your thinking about something as fundamental as what kind of car you think you should be driving, if you get 1% of the population to start agreeing with you, smaller is better. That's a huge chunk if you have a single digit market share at the time. So
Yeah.
I think that honesty is a way to build an army, right? Like people that believe in you and believe what you're saying, even if it goes against the narrative of like what the majority believe, because you can build up a pretty large army with a minority.
Yeah, I think this is going to appeal to a lot of strategists who hadn't thought about this in those terms. Because you don't think about a brief as being dishonest. It's like, wait a minute, I'm not telling lies here. But what you are doing is it's lies by omission because you haven't gotten to the point. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, do you think that this is that Mark's point about honesty is a legitimate request to cut through the bullshit, or is it a way to incite courage and steadfastness in light of the fact that there's just not always enough time to write a brief? Is this a quest for more time to do a better job on a brief, or was he really getting to the cut the
I think it,
bullshit?
I think it's both. I think honestly, it's both. There are times when, frankly, you don't have your heart in an assignment. You don't have time. You got 40 other things that are more attractive that you're supposed to be working on, and you go through the motions and you fill in the brief and you do the briefing and you know, and that's not an honest brief because you didn't give it your honest best shake at it, right? So I think the time constraints are one thing, but then there's also the courage to bring things to light that might make the client uncomfortable, because they don't want to hear that their baby has warts, right? Or that
Right.
there's these big issues, unless they've already had a sufficient come to Jesus moment that everybody is on board and understands, this is where we are, and we're not going to advance any further until we address this quality issue, this price issue, this whatever it is issue. But I think strategists, because we've gotten kind of shanghaied into being beyond just calm strategists and brief writers. We've gotten shanghaied into being corporate strategists, right? Like when marketing strategists, which is outside of our role, but because we have this strategy title, and we generally, when we present, we get good results in front of clients, and they respect our intelligence. They kind of have taken us on as consultants, and
Right.
but you have to be willing to speak the truth, and that obviously entails diplomacy because you can't just be a bull in a china shop. I learned that lesson. I built my brand on being an honest broker, but in the beginning it wasn't perhaps the smoothest honest broker, and I think that I've my maturity, I've been able to get to the same argument, uh, but finessing it a little more with clients to get them to accept the recommendation.
I think that's a nice segue into a third point. I know I promised we were just going to do one each, but it just your comment leads to another point that Mark makes, which is writing a brief isn't a cocktail party, it's gutter work, meaning you got to get down into the mud, you got to get down, boots on the ground, and try to live, which harkens back to what I said earlier. You have to walk a mile in another person's shoes to understand what she wants in a product or a service. So Mark makes that point that this is about living where the product or service is. And I'm going to tie this into an article that our friend Lance Saunders published just today or yesterday on LinkedIn in response to an essay that Dave Trott wrote, in which he said that strategy is strangling advertising. That's the title of Dave Trott's. I think it's an astute essay, but Lance takes issue with it. And I think Lance and Mark Pollard are pretty much aligned in their thinking about how the brief and strategy work. And that's what I wanted to bring up and ask you. Lance is saying, he's gotten on the delivery trucks and gone out to see how products exist in the warehouse and then go from the warehouse to the grocery store. He's been on he sat next to a shoe salesperson and watched what this guy has to do to sell a pair of shoes. He's lived what the product is doing. And I think that's what Mark is getting at when he says it's not a cocktail party, it's gutter work. You got to get down and do that. And you know how that story I love to tell about the Capodastro bar, which I won't retell, but everybody knows about it. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see yourself as a gutter worker?
Um, I think so. For sure, I will take any opportunity the client gives me to go in the field, see how things are made, how they're distributed, how they're sold. Um, I, I don't know that you necessarily need all those permissions. Like, there's a lot you can do just on your own. And I've given the example many times of like ad school students that I gave them a brief for advanced auto parts. And before I gave them that brief, I went through the effort of Googling like how far the closest advanced auto parts was to the ad school campus. And there were two within walking distance, like within a couple miles. So even if they had no transportation, if they were at the ad school, they could Chevrolegs over to the and only one of like the 20 creative teams actually went to a store and talked to a manager and looked around and looked in to see what was available on the shelves and kind of how the thing operated. So, granted, as a creative, I don't know that that's the best use of their time, although it could definitely be inspiration. If you're a creative and you think, I want to get to see what this is really all about, I don't know anything about this world, I would never try to talk them out of doing it. But I think for a strategist, it's like for sure something you have to do and try to understand the industry the best you can. There's a lot you can do at your desk nowadays.
Right.
There's a lot you can learn on YouTube. There's a lot you can learn with AI, but it's still nice to go out there into the grocery store, into the auto parts store, to the car dealership, whatever it is that the product is, and kind of smell it, breathe it, see it like, what's it really like? Because a lot of us have these perceptions of things that are either not true anymore or were never true or are based on a bad experience we might have had or you know we've only ever been to an auto parts store when we needed to get wiper blades, but we don't know
Right.
what it's like to be a shade tree mechanic that's got to be going in there 2, 3 times a week, to get different things. And so it comes back to that traits of what a good brief writer is. Somebody has to have empathy, right? Like
Right.
you may not be the shade tree. I chose that client for this exercise for the ad school because I'm a shade tree mechanic and that interests me. But I
Right.
fully knowing that none of these kids is going to be that. But this is a big industry that advertises that it's a multi billion dollar industry in terms of car parts and accessories, and it's the kind of thing that you would get assigned at an agency
Absolutely.
without any choice. So I do see it as part of putting on the costume of the target audience and seeing the world through their eyes, but also going and talking to the people at the store or at the dealership or whatever industry you're talking about, to get their take on it. Go to talk to the grocery store manager if you're doing a grocery item and ask them about it.
Yeah. Well, Henry, I'm tempted to go through every point in his PDF, and you and I could have a great conversation, but we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to encourage our viewers to find a copy of this PDF and read it because it's valuable. It might be a little scary for newbie brief writers, but it'll get them to think. It'll be a nice challenge for experienced brief writers and definitely will get them to think. So, with that, I will say, good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
He's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time,